the American frontier. A stormy night. 1873. She stood on the auction block, wrists bound, feet bare, soaked to the bone 3 hours after giving birth. 3 hours. Then they took Lily away. The gavel cracked down. $100. $150. $200. $250. A stranger stepped out of the shadows, pulled her bill of sale from his coat, and held it over the fire without a word. He watched it burn. Then he looked straight at her across the flames. "I bought your freedom tonight." His voice was flat and cold. "Not you. You understand the difference." Ellie watched the last ash curl and die. Her jaw tightened. "What do I give in return?" "A name on a marriage certificate. That's all I need. If you want to know what happens next, stay with me." The rain came down hard that night. It hammered the tin roof of the auction hall like it had a grudge, loud enough to drown out the thunder, loud enough to drown out a woman screaming if she had any breath left to scream. Eleanor Vance had none. She stood on the raised platform in wet clothes that clung to her skin, her wrists bound with rope, her body still aching from the birth. 3 hours. That was all she'd had with her daughter before they took the baby away. 3 hours. And then Lily was gone. The auctioneer's voice cut through the noise of the crowd. He was a sweating, red-faced man in a brown coat, and he read from his paper like he was listing livestock. Female, mid-20s, good health, literate, reads and writes, excellent for domestic service. Men talked among themselves. Some leaned forward. Some didn't bother to look at her face at all. Ellie stood straight. She decided that in the same moment, her knees tried to give out. She locked them. She kept her chin level. If this was the last thing she could control, she would control it. Her body had been through enough tonight. It would not betray her here. The bidding started low. A fat man in a wool coat opened with $40. Someone near the door matched it. The auctioneer mopped his forehead, called for more, and got it. Numbers climbed. Ellie tracked them the way she tracked everything quietly, carefully, filing each detail away. The man in the wool coat wanted her badly. He kept his paddle up without hesitation. She'd seen men like him before. She knew what they wanted and what they didn't mind doing to get it. $70. $80. Her arms were shaking. She didn't let it show in her face. The door at the back of the hall swung open. Rain blew in sideways. A man stepped through, and he shut the door behind him without slamming it. He was tall, that was the first thing. Then the hat, dark and dripping. He had the build of a man who worked in cold weather and didn't complain about it. He moved through the crowd without hurrying, without shoving, and men stepped aside anyway. He stopped near the middle of the room and looked at Ellie. She looked back. $100. The woolcoat man called out. The newcomer raised his hand. $150. The room went quiet for a moment. Not long, just long enough for that number to land. Bidding started again, faster now. The woolcoat man pushed to $180. The tall stranger went to $200 without blinking. A third man tried at $220. The stranger said $250, and his voice was so flat, so without urgency, that it did something strange. It made the other men hesitate. There was no emotion to feed off, no desperation to exploit. $250 once, $250 twice. The gavel came down. Ellie heard it above the rain. That sharp, dry crack of wood on wood. The sound that decided what happened to her next. She breathed in slowly through her nose. Her daughter was somewhere in this town, in some house she hadn't seen, with people she didn't know. She would find her. She had to find her. But first she had to survive tonight. The tall man paid in cash. They untied her wrists and handed her over to him the way you'd hand over a parcel at a post office. He took the paper, the bill of sale, and folded it once, put it in his coat pocket, and then turned and walked toward the door. He didn't pull her by the arm. He didn't tell her to follow. He just walked. And somehow that was enough. Ellie followed. Outside, the rain was merciless. He had a horse waiting at the post and a second one beside it, already saddled. He untied them both and led them down the road without a word. Ellie walked with him. She had no boots, they'd taken those, and the mud was cold against her feet. But she didn't say anything either. There was nothing to say yet. At the edge of the tree line, where the road bent and the auction hall lights fell away behind them, he stopped. He built a small fire with the ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. Using wood he pulled from a saddlebag wrapped in canvas. When the flames caught, he reached into his coat and pulled out the bill of sale. He didn't say anything. He held it over the fire, and he let it burn. Ellie watched the paper curl and blacken and fall apart. The edges turned orange, then dark. It was gone in under a minute. He looked at her across the fire. His face was weathered, lines around the eyes, jaw rough with a few days of growth. He wasn't young, and he wasn't pretty. He looked like the frontier worn in, hard used, still standing. "My name is Silas Boone," he said. "I run a ranch about 6 miles north. I need a wife on paper legal marriage, so the government can't dispute my claim on the land I've been clearing. They've been looking for any reason to pull the title." He paused. "You need somewhere safe to heal, and you need someone with enough guns and enough reach to help you get your child back." Ellie said nothing. She watched him. "I bought your freedom tonight," he said. "Not you. You understand the difference." She understood it. She wasn't sure she believed it, not yet, but she understood what he was saying. "What do I give in return?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "A name on a certificate. That's all I need." He crouched down, feeding another stick to the fire. "You run the household as you see fit. Martha, my housekeeper, she's already there. You make your own decisions. I won't tell you what to do or where to go. When this is over, when the land claim is settled and your daughter is home, you can walk. No argument from me." Ellie looked at the ashes where her bill of sale had been. She thought about Harlan Croft, the man who had taken Lily, the man who had smiled when the rope went around her wrists. He had money and influence and the law in his pocket, and she had nothing. No shelter, no papers, no family. She was standing barefoot in the mud 3 hours after giving birth, and the only offer on the table was coming from a stranger with a campfire and a horse. It wasn't a good situation, but it was the first one tonight that had given her any ground to stand on. "I want it in writing," she said. "What you just told me, that I'm free to go." Silas looked up at her. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small notebook and a stub of pencil. He wrote something down, tore the page out, and held it across the fire. She read it. Short, plain sentences, exactly what he'd said. He signed it, and at the bottom, he'd left a line for her. She took the pencil. She signed. He nodded once, like the matter was settled, and started putting out the fire. Ellie held the page and looked at the dark tree line beyond the horses. 6 miles north, a ranch, a housekeeper, and a man she didn't know, somewhere behind her, in the town she was leaving. Her daughter was asleep in someone else's arms. She folded the page and tucked it against her chest, under her dress, close to her skin. She would find Lily. She would find a way. But she would not find it dead in a ditch or owned by the man in the wool coat. She had made it through tonight. That was something. That was enough to build on. Silas handed her the reins of the second horse. She took them without hesitation. She put her foot in the stirrup bare, cold, muddy, and she pulled herself up. It hurt. Everything hurt. She sat straight anyway. Silas mounted his horse beside her and turned north. Ellie followed. Behind them, the last coals of the fire glowed orange in the rain, and then they went dark, and the night swallowed them whole. The ranch appeared out of the dark like something solid in a dream. A main house, 2 stories, wood-framed, with a covered porch that wrapped around the front. A barn to the left, larger than the house. Fencing that stretched out in both directions, disappearing into the black. Ellie counted the outbuildings out of habit. 4 that she could see. A water trough near the barn door. A vegetable garden along the south wall of the house. Winter bare, but carefully staked. Someone maintained this place. That told her something. Silas dismounted and tied his horse at the post without rushing. A light moved inside the house, a lantern, behind curtains. Before he could even reach the porch steps, the front door opened. The woman who came out was short, broad-shouldered, with gray hair pulled back tight, and a face that had been through weather and wasn't afraid of more. She wore a nightgown with a shawl thrown over it and held the lantern up to look at Ellie without any embarrassment about staring. "This is Martha," Silas said. "I figured," Ellie said. Martha looked at her feet first, then back up at her face. "Get inside," Martha said. It wasn't a question. Ellie got inside. The kitchen was warm. A wood stove in the corner still had coals banked in it, and Martha stoked them up without being asked and put a pot of water on before Ellie had even sat down. The table was solid oak, scarred from years of use. Ellie put her hands flat on it and felt the grain under her palms. Real, solid, still here. She was still here. Silas came in long enough to set her small bundle on the floor near the stairs. He'd retrieved it from his saddlebag, a cloth sack that held everything she'd managed to keep. He didn't make a production of it. He just set it down and looked at Martha. "She'll take the main room upstairs," he said. Martha nodded. He looked at Ellie. "Sleep. We'll talk more when there's daylight." He turned and went back out the door. Ellie heard his boots on the porch steps. Then, nothing. The rain was quieting down. Finally, she looked at Martha. "Where is he sleeping?" she asked. "Barn," Martha said, not turning around from the stove. Ellie sat with that for a moment. "He does that often. Never done it before tonight," Martha said. She turned and set a mug of hot water in front of Ellie, then added a handful of dried chamomile from a tin on the shelf. "Drink that." Ellie drank it. Martha didn't ask questions that night. She heated water for a bath, left clean clothes outside the door, without knocking. And when Ellie finally got into the bed in the main room, upstairs, a real bed, with a quilt that smelled like cedar and lavender, Martha knocked twice, waited, and said through the door, "I'm down the hall if you need anything." That was all. No speeches, no explanations. Ellie lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about Lily. She thought about the weight of her, those 3 hours, the way a newborn sounds when she breathes, that small, unsteady rhythm. She thought about where Lily was sleeping tonight, whose arms had her, whether she was warm. She pressed her fist against her mouth. Then she breathed. She couldn't fall apart. Not yet. Not until Lily was back. After that, after she could fall apart as much as she needed to. But right now, she needed to be useful. She needed to be the kind of person who survived long enough to find her daughter. She slept in the days that followed. Ellie learned the shape of the place. Silas Boone was not a man who talked to fill silence. He spoke when he had something to say, and went quiet when he didn't. And after a week, Ellie realized she respected that more than she expected to. There was nothing worse, in her experience, than a man who kept talking to make himself feel better while you were the one suffering. He knocked before entering any room she was in, every single time. She noticed that on the second day. On the third day, she tested it. She was in the kitchen when he came to the doorway, and she watched him stop at the frame and wait. He didn't lean in. He didn't assume. "Do you need anything from town?" he asked. "Ink," she said, "and paper." He came back with both. When she flinched, and she did flinch, sometimes, when a door slammed or a horse made a sudden noise, or someone came up behind her. Without warning, he didn't say anything about it. He didn't explain to her that she was safe now, that it was over, that she had nothing to fear. She hated that. She hated when people said that, because it wasn't about reason. Her body had its own memory, and it didn't care about reassurances. Silas seemed to understand that without being told. When she startled, he simply stilled. He didn't move toward her. He didn't back away either, which would have felt worse somehow, like she was something to be frightened of. He just waited. He let her breathing settle on its own. That was the thing about respect. It wasn't one big gesture. It was 100 small ones, stacked up day after day, that told a person, "I see what you need, and I'm going to give it to you without making you ask." He gave her the horse she picked. She walked the fence line with him one afternoon to look at the animals in the paddock, and he stood back and let her take her time. She chose a bay mare with a white blaze, steady-eyed and calm. Good eye was all Silas said. She named the mare Ida, after her grandmother. By the end of the second week, Ellie was going through Silas's books. She hadn't asked permission. Exactly. She'd found the ledger on his desk while she was cleaning, opened it out of habit, and read 3 pages before she understood She was holding a financial disaster in her hands. His shipping contracts were bleeding money. The rates he was paying to move cattle were at least 30% over market, and two of his supplier agreements were written with penalty clauses, so lopsided it was a wonder he'd signed them. She sat down at the desk and read the whole ledger cover to cover. That night at supper they ate together, mostly out of practicality. Martha, at the head of the table, because she'd held that spot for years and wasn't giving it up for anyone. Ellie pushed the ledger across to Silas. "You're being robbed by your own contracts," she said. He looked at the page she'd marked. "I know," he said. "What are you doing about it?" He looked up at her. "I'm working on it. I can help with that," she said, "if you want." He studied her for a moment. She held the look steady. "All right," he said. Martha poured more coffee and said nothing, but the corner of her mouth moved. The third week was when Ellie found the revolver. She came down to the kitchen before dawn. She slept badly some nights, and when she did, she found it better to be moving than to lie there fighting with the dark. And the gun was on the kitchen table, a Colt Army revolver, loaded, with a folded piece of paper beside it. She opened the paper. The handwriting was blunt and a little crooked. The writing of a man who used his hands more than a pen. It said, "Use it if you need to, even on me." She stood there in the pre-dawn quiet, with the note in one hand and the gun on the table in front of her. She picked up the revolver, checked the cylinder, 6 rounds, all seated clean, good condition, well-oiled. She set it back down and read the note again. "Even on me." He was not saying he trusted her. That wasn't the point. He was saying that it didn't matter whether he trusted her or not. The gun was hers because she needed to be the one who decided what happened to her body. Nobody was going to take that away again. Not Harlan Croft. Not the law. Not even the man who'd burned her bill of sale. She kept the revolver. She started sleeping with it under her pillow. She slept better after that. Spring came to the Boone Ranch quietly, the way good things sometimes do. The snow melted off in patches, leaving the grass coming up pale and new underneath. The creek ran fast with snowmelt. Ellie started a kitchen garden along the south wall, working the soil in the mornings before the sun got high. Martha watched from the porch the first day, went back inside the second, and on the third morning came out with her own pair of gloves and started working the next row without saying a word. They got along, the two of them. Martha wasn't soft. She didn't flutter or fuss. She said what she thought, and she expected you to say what you thought back. And she didn't carry grudges past sundown. Ellie could work with that. Silas rode out most mornings to check the fence lines, or push cattle to new pasture, or manage the endless small emergencies that came with running a working ranch. He came back at dusk, ate supper, went over whatever Ellie had marked in the books, and went back out to the barn. Clean, predictable. She knew where he was and what he was doing, and she found she liked that about him more than almost anything else. The books were getting better. Ellie had spent 2 weeks working through the supplier contracts, and she'd found a lawyer in the next county, a small, precise man named Pratt, who wore the same brown vest every time she saw him, who confirmed that 2 of the penalty clauses were unenforceable under territorial law. Silas renegotiated both. The shipping rate was trickier, but Ellie found a competing route and put together a letter that made the original shipper come back with a lower number before the week was out. Silas said, at the end of that week, "You saved this ranch about $400. "I know," she said. He almost smiled. She saw it at the corner of his eye before it went away. She was becoming indispensable. She understood that. She also understood it was her best protection. For now, a useful person was harder to remove than a burden. She had learned that the hard way, but Harlan Croft was patient. The first sign was the creek. Silas noticed it before she did. He was checking the south pasture water source and came back to the house in the early afternoon, which he never did. His face was flat, controlled, but his jaw was set differently. He sat down at the kitchen table and Ellie put a mug of coffee in front of him without asking. "Someone's put animal carcasses upstream," he said. 3 of them, far enough up that you wouldn't find them unless you were looking. Martha stopped moving in the corner. The water's been making the cattle sick, he continued. I thought it was the season changing. It wasn't. Ellie sat down across from him. How long to clear it? 2, 3 days to be sure. And the cattle? We'll lose maybe 2 head. Should have caught it sooner. He said that last part, like it cost him something. You didn't put those carcasses there, Ellie said. No, he agreed. But they're on my land. She looked at her coffee. She was thinking about Harlan Croft. And she was thinking about silence. This was how he worked. She remembered that now. From before, from the months she'd spent in his household, invisible and watchful, memorizing things she hadn't meant to memorize. Harlan didn't announce himself. He didn't send threatening letters. He squeezed, slowly, quietly, in ways that looked like bad luck until you realized the bad luck was following a pattern. She didn't say any of that yet. She needed to be sure. The horse confirmed it. 4 days after the creek. One of Silas's geldings was found at the tree line on the east side of the property. It had been put down with a single clean shot, not predators, not an accident. Someone had walked up to that animal and killed it deliberately, and then left it there to be found. Silas stood at the edge of the trees and looked at the dead horse for a long time. Ellie stood beside him. This isn't random, she said. No, Harlan Croft doesn't do things randomly. Silas looked at her. Tell me what you know. She'd been weighing this. How much to say? How much to hold back? Not because she didn't trust him she was getting there. Slowly, but because once she said it, it became his problem too. And he hadn't signed up for this part. But he was already in it. The creek and the horse had made sure of that. Before Lily was born, she said. I was in Harlan's household for almost 6 months. Not willingly. She kept her voice even. He ran me as domestic help. But the house was small. I heard things. I saw things I wasn't supposed to see. What things? She looked at the dead gelding in the grass. He keeps a second ledger, she said. A shadow ledger. It documents land transactions across 4 counties' purchases made under false names. Titles filed with forged signatures. Property stolen from homesteaders who didn't know what papers they were signing. He has a clerk who documents everything, because Harlan doesn't trust anyone's memory but his own. Silas was very still. I saw it twice, she said. I read fast. She tapped her temple. I remember everything I read. You're a witness, he said. I'm more than a witness, she said. I'm the only person outside his operation who knows the structure of it, the names, the amounts, the counties, all of it. The wind moved through the grass between them and the trees. That's why he took Lily, she said. He needed leverage. And when the auction happened, when he thought he'd gotten rid of me, he didn't expect anyone to bid. He didn't expect me to walk out of there. He didn't expect me, Silas said. No, she agreed. He didn't expect you. In the distance, back near the barn, the dogs started barking, all 4 of them at once, frantic and sharp, the sound tearing through the quiet afternoon like a blade. Silas was moving before the sound stopped, his hand already at his hip, his eyes cutting to the tree line. Ellie was right behind him. She had her revolver. The dogs kept barking. Whatever had set them off, man or animal, close or at the perimeter, was still out there. The trees were still. The light was going gold with late afternoon. Everything looked quiet. That was the problem with Harlan. Things could look perfectly quiet and still be closing in around you. Silas reached the barn, checked the horses all present, walked the fence line on the near side. The dogs had slowed to a low, continuous growl, still alert, still pointing east. He came back to where Ellie stood in the yard. I didn't find anything, he said. That doesn't mean it wasn't there, she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. No, he said. It doesn't. He went back to the barn to settle the dogs. Ellie stood in the yard a little longer, looking at the tree line. The light kept fading. The trees held their silence. She thought, he's out there, somewhere in those counties, sitting at a desk or a table, patient as rot, watching his people squeeze. She thought, I remember everything in that ledger. Every name, every number, every county clerk he paid off, and every homesteader he stole from, she thought. He made a mistake when he let me live long enough to remember. She turned and walked back to the house. Martha had supper on. The kitchen smelled like wood smoke and dried herbs and something solid and real. Ellie washed her hands at the basin and sat down at the table and picked up her pen and opened her notebook to a fresh page. She started writing down names. The forged documents arrived on a Tuesday. Ellie found them slipped under the front door in the early morning, before Martha was up, before Silas had come in from the barn. A plain envelope, no name on the outside. She almost left it on the table for Silas. Then she opened it. 3 pages, official-looking, with stamps and signatures at the bottom. The first was a loan agreement between Silas Boone and the Territorial Bank of Carson, dated 8 months prior, for a sum of $6,000. The second was a deed amendment, listing the ranch property as collateral against that loan. The third was a marriage broker's certificate, not the simple document she and Silas had signed, but something more elaborate, with legal language that ran on for paragraphs, and buried in the middle of it, a clause that named Ellie as a secondary collateral interest against the debt. She read it 3 times. Her hands were steady. She made sure of that. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and read it a 4th time, slower, picking apart every sentence. The language was good. Whoever had written it knew what they were doing. The loan agreement had the right stamps, the right formatting. The deed amendment referenced actual parcel numbers she recognized from Silas's real paperwork. And the marriage certificate, the fake one, had her real signature on it. She knew her own handwriting, but the signature was just different enough that she couldn't be completely certain it was forged. And that uncertainty was exactly the point. She was still sitting there when Martha came downstairs. Martha looked at the papers. She looked at Ellie's face. She put the coffee on. "What is it?" Martha asked. "I don't know yet," Ellie said, which was honest. She knew what the papers claimed. She didn't know what was real. She put the documents in her room before Silas came in for breakfast. She needed to think before she talked. Panic was a tool that other people used against you. She'd learned that. When you panicked, you made decisions fast, and those decisions were rarely your own. They were shaped by whoever had created the panic in the first place. So she didn't panic, she thought. Over the next 2 days, she watched Silas differently. She told herself she was just being careful. She watched how he handled money, watched whether he was anxious about the books in ways he hadn't been before. She watched how he treated her, whether anything had shifted, whether there was something behind his steadiness that she'd been too grateful to notice. She found nothing. Silas was exactly what he'd been since the first night. Measured, consistent. He knocked. He gave her space. He went over the ledger numbers with her every evening and deferred to her judgment on the shipping contracts without argument. But the documents were still in her room, and trauma had a way of making the worst explanation feel like the only one. She'd trusted people before. She'd read them right, or thought she had, and been wrong in ways that had cost her everything. Harlan Croft had presented himself as a businessman who needed household help and paid fairly and didn't ask too many questions. She'd believed that for about 2 weeks before the truth of her situation became impossible to ignore. By then, it was too late. On the 3rd morning, she caught herself standing at her bedroom window, watching Silas cross the yard to the barn. And she was thinking, what if the documents are real? What if the marriage certificate was always meant to trap you here? What if you're not free, and you never were? She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. The thing about fear was that it didn't need facts. It just needed a crack in your certainty. And it would pour through and fill every corner of the room until you couldn't think straight. And she had cracks. God, she had cracks. Her daughter was somewhere out there with people. Ellie didn't know. And every day Lily was gone was another day the cracks got wider. That night she couldn't eat. Martha noticed. Martha put a plate in front of her, and Ellie moved the food around, and Martha watched her for a long moment, then looked at Silas, then looked back at her plate. Martha didn't say anything, which meant Martha was thinking. Silas noticed, too. "You all right?" "Fine," Ellie said. He looked at her. He didn't push it. That was what he always did. Didn't push. And right now, in her current state, that restraint felt like confirmation of something. though she couldn't have said what. She went upstairs early. She took the documents out and read them again in the lamplight. The loan agreement, the deed, the marriage clause, secondary collateral interest. If Silas defaulted on the loan, the bank could claim her. That's what it said. That's what it was designed to say. And if the loan was real, and the debt was real, then the whole arrangement, the burned bill of sale, the revolver on the table, the knocked doors, and the chosen horse, all of it could be a long game. A patient trap. Harlan wasn't the only man who could run one of those. She sat with it until the lamp burned low. Then she made her decision. She would leave. Not because she was certain the documents were real. She wasn't. But because she couldn't afford to be wrong. Lily needed a mother who was free and moving, not a mother sitting in someone else's house waiting to find out if she was collateral. She would take her horse, take her revolver, take her notebooks, all those names. All that information she'd been writing down from Harlan's shadow ledger, and she would ride to lawyer Pratt in the next county and figure out the truth from there, on her own terms, on ground she'd chosen. She started packing before midnight. She was methodical about it. One saddlebag, nothing heavy. The notebooks, wrapped in oilcloth. Her revolver and the extra rounds she'd been given. A change of clothes. The little money she'd set aside from the household accounts. Martha had insisted she take a small wage, and Ellie had not argued. She wrote a note, short. She left it on the kitchen table. Then she looked at it and picked it back up and put it in her pocket. If she was right about Silas, the note would help him find her. If she was wrong, she didn't want to give him that. She went down the back stairs. The kitchen was dark. The house was quiet. Outside, the wind had been picking up all evening, and now it moved against the walls in long, low pushes. She could feel the cold coming under the door before she opened it. She stepped out into the yard. The sky was wrong. Too dark, even for a winter night. The clouds had built up dense and fast, the way they did before a blizzard. And the wind had that specific bite, not just cold, but warning, telling everything, with good sense, to find shelter. Ellie looked at the sky and then at the barn. She kept moving. The barn was warmer than the house, actually, with the body heat of the animals. She found Ida in the third stall, awake and alert, ears moving in that quick way that meant the horse felt the weather coming too. Ellie saddled her quietly, working by feel more than sight, keeping her movements slow so the other horses wouldn't kick up noise. She led Ida to the barn door. She stopped. She stood there for a full minute, her hand on the door, the wind pushing against the other side of it. She thought about the revolver on the kitchen table. Use it if you need to, even on me. She thought about the first morning she'd come downstairs and found it there. Nobody had ever done that in her whole life. Nobody had handed her a weapon and said, "You decide. You're in charge here, even of me." She thought about how long it had taken her to sleep without waking up, gasping, and how, the first night she'd slept straight through, it had been in this barn's direction, knowing Silas was out there and not inside the walls with her. She thought about Lily. She opened the barn door and led Ida out into the dark. The wind hit her immediately, sharp, mean, carrying the first edge of snow. She mounted up, pointed Ida north along the fence line, and rode behind her. The ranch lights disappeared one by one as the distance grew, and the snow began to fall. She rode hard, keeping the fence to her left, trying to stay oriented. The snow came faster than she expected. Within 20 minutes, the world had narrowed to the few feet in front of Ida's nose. Everything else gone white and howling. Ellie bent low over the mare's neck and kept going. She almost didn't hear them. 3 men, coming from the trees on the right. They were in position before she understood what was happening. They'd been waiting, she realized, which meant they'd known she'd run, which meant the documents had worked exactly as they were supposed to work. The middleman pulled his horse across her path. "Easy now," he said. He had a flat voice, unhurried. "Mr. Croft figured you'd bolt." Ellie pulled Ida up hard. The mare danced sideways in the snow. "Man set a real nice little trap," the man continued. "You read those papers exactly the way he hoped." She had her hand on the revolver. "Now you can pull that iron if it makes you feel better," he said. "But there's 3 of us and 1 of you, and you're already half frozen. So I'd say the math don't favor it. The other two men moved to flank her. She tracked them by the sound of their horses in the snow, keeping her eyes on the man in front. Harlan Croft made those documents, she said. He made them to move you, the man said. Easy as anything. And here you are. Moved, she raised the revolver. Then the shot came from nowhere, from the white, from the storm, from some direction she couldn't pin down. And the man on her left grabbed his shoulder and yelled. His horse bolted sideways. The middle man spun around. A second shot, and his hat was gone, blown clean off his head by something that had passed very close. Silas came out of the blizzard on horseback, his rifle up, his face cut by wind and snow, his expression exactly as flat as it always was, except for his eyes, which were very, very focused. Ride, he said to Ellie. The middleman was already backing his horse. The wounded man was managing his animal one-handed, trying to get control. The third man made a calculation and decided he didn't like the odds anymore. They turned and went back into the trees. Silas moved his horse alongside Ida. You all right? Yes, she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. Good. He looked at the trees where the men had disappeared. We need to go. There'll be more. He turned his horse south, back toward the ranch. Ellie started to follow, and then everything came apart at once. Somewhere in the white, another group of men had come around the other side. She heard them before she saw them, hooves in the snow, multiple horses, moving fast. Silas swung his rifle around. A shot cracked past them. Ida reared, and Ellie held on. But another shot hit close, and the mare bolted sideways and then forward, and Ellie let her go, crouching low, because a moving target was harder, and right now moving was surviving. She rode blind into the white. Behind her, she heard more shots, Silas's voice cutting through once, sharp and commanding. Then the wind swallowed everything, and she was alone in the blizzard with no direction and no landmark, and the cold biting through her coat like it was nothing. Ida ran until she slowed, until the panic faded out of her legs, and she came back to a stumbling trot, breathing hard, steam pouring off her neck. Ellie straightened up and looked around. Trees, close trees on all sides. She'd ridden into the woods. The wind was lower here, blocked by the trunks, but the snow was still falling, and the dark was total, and she had no idea which direction was home. She pulled Ida to a stop and listened. Nothing. Just the wind and the creak of branches and the sound of snow finding its way through the canopy. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, she told herself. Cold. It was the cold. She started to shiver properly then, deep shivering, the kind that came from the inside out. She'd been riding in this weather for too long with too little on. She'd packed for speed, not for a blizzard. She slid off Ida's back. Her legs took her weight and then didn't, and she went down to one knee in the snow. She got back up. She grabbed the stirrup and used it, and got back up and put her hand on the mare's side and breathed. She couldn't ride anymore. She couldn't feel her feet. She made it to the base of a large pine tree, its branches spreading wide enough to have kept some ground clear underneath. She sat down against the trunk. Ida stood nearby, head dropped, breathing slow. Ellie's eyes were heavy. She was aware, at some distance from herself, that this was dangerous. That going to sleep in this temperature meant not waking up. She knew that. She tried to hold on to it as the shivering slowed, which was not a good sign. The shivering slowing, and the dark pressed in from all sides. A shadow moved through the trees, large, coming closer. She reached for her revolver. Her fingers wouldn't close properly. The shadow kept coming, and she watched it. And she was too cold to be afraid anymore. Just too cold. And then the shadow stepped into the small, open space at the base of the pine, and she saw the face. Silas. His coat was covered in snow. His hat was gone somewhere in the blizzard. There was a cut on his cheekbone, dark with dried blood, from something she hadn't seen happen. He crouched down in front of her and looked at her face, and then at her hands. And whatever he saw there made him move fast. He pulled off his outer coat and put it around her before she could argue. Then he took her hands and held them between both of his, hard, pressing warmth into fingers that couldn't feel anything. He didn't say a word. He just worked. steady and deliberate, like this was a problem to solve, and he was solving it. She watched his face. He was not angry. She had run from his ranch in a blizzard, fallen into a trap, almost gotten them both shot. And he was crouched in the snow in his shirt sleeves, pressing warmth back into her hands. And there was nothing on his face but concentration. "Silas," she said. "Don't talk yet," he said. "Get warm first." So she did. He found the cabin by memory. He'd trapped this section of woods 10 years back, before the ranch was what it was now. When he'd been younger and broker and spending winters in the back country, because it was cheaper than buying feed. He hadn't been to the trapper's cabin in years. He wasn't certain it was still standing. It was standing, barely. The roof had lost some shingles on the east side, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. But the walls were solid, and the stone fireplace in the corner was intact. Silas got the door open and got Ellie inside and got the horse tied to the support beam at the side of the building, which was sheltered enough. Then he built the fire. He worked fast, pulling wood from the stack under the lean-to at the back of the cabin dry. Old wood, better than anything he could have hoped for. He had flint in his pocket, out of habit. One of those habits that felt like superstition until it saved your life. The fire caught. Ellie was sitting on the floor near the wall, his coat still around her, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. She was shivering again, which was actually better than the stillness from out in the snow. Shivering meant the body was still fighting. He pulled the single wool blanket from the narrow shelf along the wall left by whoever had last used this place, stiff with age, but intact, and spread it near the fire. "Move here," he said. She moved, slower than she would have an hour ago, but she got there. He kept his back to her while she settled, feeding the fire until it was throwing real heat across the small room. The wind hit the cabin walls in gusts, found the gaps in the logs, came through in thin, cold threads. The fire pushed back. When he turned around, she was looking at him directly. "You came after me," she said. "Yes." "How did you know I'd left?" "Heard the barn door," he said. "I sleep light." She was quiet a moment. "And you just rode out into a blizzard," he said. "So yes." She looked down at her hands. They were pink now, the color coming back. She flexed her fingers slowly, testing them. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "You don't owe me anything." "I do," she said. "I made a decision based on information that was put in front of me deliberately to make me run. And I ran. And I need to explain that. Because, Ellie." He sat down on the other side of the fire, close enough for warmth, far enough to give her air. "Whatever was in that envelope, I saw it on the table this morning. You'd moved it, but not quite far enough. I recognized the paper stock." She looked up. "Harlan's people use the same supplier for their official documents," he said. "I've seen that stock before. Man named Greaves runs the print shop in Heller Creek, and he does most of Harlan's paperwork. I didn't know what was in the envelope, but I knew where it came from." She stared at him. "Why didn't you say something?" she asked. "Because I was waiting to see if you'd come to me." He met her eyes across the fire. "I wasn't going to force that conversation. If you didn't trust me enough to ask, then that was information I needed to have." She sat with that. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the walls of the cabin with a sound like the whole world leaning in. Inside, the light was amber and steady. "The loan isn't real," she said. "The debt." "No," he said. "I have no debt with the Territorial Bank. I can show you every document I hold, every payment, every receipt. Nothing matches what was in that envelope. And the marriage clause, also invented." His voice didn't waver. "The certificate we signed is straightforward. It's a legal marriage to protect the land claim. That's the whole of it. There's no secondary interest, no collateral, no mechanism for anyone to use you as a debt instrument. That's not what this is." She exhaled. It wasn't relief. Exactly. It was the slow release of something she'd been holding at great cost for 3 days, the lowering of a weight that had been pulling her under, by inches. She hadn't realized how much of herself she'd been spending, just to carry it. "I should have asked you," she said, instead of running. "You've been given good reason not to trust men who explain things to your face," he said. "I'm not going to fault you for that." He said it simply, not as a performance of understanding. not to make himself look generous, just as a plain fact, one he'd clearly thought about. She looked at the fire. Harlan's men were waiting for me, she said. They knew I'd run. They said he'd figured I'd bolt. He knows how trauma works, Silas said, and there was a hardness in his voice that she hadn't heard before. He uses it deliberately. He introduces doubt where someone is already uncertain, and he times it for when they're most isolated and most afraid. He's done it before to homesteaders, to business partners, to anyone he needs to move in a particular direction. He's been studying me, she said. He's been studying your situation, Silas said. He knows you're still searching for Lily. He knows that's where your fear lives. So he created a document that implied you were already trapped, already used, already lied to right when you were most desperate to act. She turned that over carefully. He wanted me out of the house, she said, away from your protection. In the open, yes. It was never about the documents being believed permanently. He just needed me to believe them long enough to run. Yes, Silas looked at her, which means he's shifting tactics. The creek, the horse, those were pressure. This was a move. He's getting impatient. The fire shifted, settling. A log broke apart and threw sparks up. Silas leaned forward and adjusted it without taking his eyes off her. She thought about Harlan, patient and calculating at his desk somewhere in those 4 counties. She thought about the shadow ledger in her memory, all those names, all those amounts, the counties, and the clerks, and the forged signatures. She had it all, every line of it. She'd spent 3 weeks writing it down from memory, page by careful page, and it was sitting in her notebooks at the ranch, wrapped in oilcloth. She had enough to destroy him. She just needed to stay alive long enough to hand it to the right person. I need to tell you something, she said. Silas waited. The reason Harlan wants me silenced isn't wounded pride, she said, and it isn't about Lily, not directly. Lily is leverage. But the reason he needs me gone is that I know the structure of his fraud operation. All of it. Names, amounts, property records, which clerks he's bought, and how much he paid them. I memorized his shadow ledger when I was in his household. I've been writing it down. Silas was very still. It covers 4 counties, she said. Land fraud mostly. Homesteaders who signed documents they didn't understand. Titles filed under false names. Property seized through manufactured debt, the same thing he just tried to manufacture for you. He's been running this for at least 5 years. She watched his face. And it's all in your notebooks, he said slowly. At the ranch, yes. He looked at the cabin wall like he could see through it. Like he was looking at the ranch 6 miles away through the blizzard. Then we need to get back, he said. In the morning, she said. When it's light and the storm's down. He looked at her. She looked back. In the morning, he agreed. He stayed awake through the night. She was aware of that. Even when she drifted, he kept the fire going. And every time she surfaced, she could see him sitting on the other side of it, facing the door, his rifle across his knees. He didn't sleep. He watched. She lay on her side on the floor with the blanket and his coat both over her, and she looked at the fire, and she thought about what it meant that he'd ridden out into a blizzard after her without hesitation or accusation. She thought about what it meant that he'd seen the envelope and waited, given her the chance to choose trust on her own terms instead of demanding it. She thought about Lily, somewhere out there, and she let herself feel that fully for a few minutes, the missing, the ache, the fear, and then she folded it back down carefully. Not away, just held it in a place she could carry. She would find her daughter. She would bring down Harlan Croft. She would do both. Around 4 in the morning, Silas added another log to the fire, and she said his name without planning to. He looked over. Thank you, she said. He shook his head once, like it didn't need saying. It does need saying, she said. He was quiet a moment. Then, get some more sleep. We ride at first light. She almost said something else. She stopped herself. She slept. When the gray light started coming through the gaps in the roof, and the wind outside had dropped to something manageable, she heard Silas moving and opened her eyes. He was already at the fire, banking it down, checking his rifle. The cut on his cheek had dried dark overnight. She sat up. The cold was still real, but not violent, outside the cabin walls. The blizzard had spent itself. Silas turned and looked at her. He reached down and picked up her saddlebag and held it out. She took it. Then he reached down again and held out her revolver, which he must have retrieved from the snow at some point in the night. She took that too. He looked at her steadily across the dimming light of the coals. "You've been free since the first night," he said. "Nothing that happened out there changed that." He nodded at the door, at Ida waiting outside. "Go find your child, or stay and fight with me." He paused. "The choice is yours." She looked at the revolver in her hand. She looked at the door. She looked at him. He meant it. She could see that clearly. No agenda behind it. No trap in the wording. If she walked out that door and pointed Ida away from the Boone Ranch and didn't come back, he would let her go. He would not follow. He would not hold the burn bill of sale over her, or the signed notebook page, or any of it. He would just let her go. And somehow the fact that he meant it completely was exactly why she wasn't going to. She stood up. She put the revolver in her belt. She picked up her saddlebag. "We ride together," she said. Something moved across his face. Brief. Gone before she could name it. He picked up his rifle and his hat from the floor. He'd found it somewhere in the night, apparently, and opened the cabin door. Outside, the world was white and still and very quiet. The storm had remade everything, covered all the tracks and the blood and the chaos of the night before. The sky was a clean pale gray, the light coming up slow and even. Ida stood at the side of the cabin, patient, dusted with snow. They saddled up in silence and rode south through the trees. Following the line, Silas knew from memory. The snow was deep, but Ida was steady. The cold was clean now, not cruel. "After a while," Ellie said, "when we get back, I want to go over the shipping agreements again. I think there's another route we haven't looked at." Silas glanced at her sideways. "All right," he said. They rode on. The ranch appeared out of the white, the same way it had appeared out of the dark on the first night solid, real still there. The lights were on inside. Martha had smoke coming from the chimney already. The smell of wood smoke and coffee reached them before they'd even dismounted. Ellie looked at the house. She looked at the garden along the south wall, all buried under snow now, but still staked, still organized, still waiting for spring. She dismounted and tied Ida at the post. Then she went inside. Martha had coffee on the stove before they'd finished, unsaddling the horses. She didn't say a word when they walked through the door. She looked at the cut on Silas's face and the state of Ellie's coat, and she set 2 mugs on the table and turned back to the stove. That was Martha. She read a situation and responded to what it actually needed, rather than what she could say about it. Ellie sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around the mug. The kitchen was warm, real solid warm, not the desperate warmth of a fire in an abandoned cabin built against a blizzard, but the ordinary warmth of a house that had been lived in and heated for years. It settled into her slowly, moving from her hands up through her arms. Silas sat across from her. He had the cut cleaned and covered before he touched his coffee, using the kit Martha silently placed on the table. He did it himself, methodically, the way he did most things. "I need to tell you something," Ellie said. Silas looked up. "I told you in the cabin why Harlan wants me silenced. The ledger." She kept her voice even. "What I didn't tell you is that I was afraid for a long time that you might be working with him." He held her gaze. "Not now," she said. "Not after last night. But before those first weeks, I didn't know who you were, or why you'd really pulled me off that platform. Men don't spend $250 on a stranger out of goodwill. I spent it on a legal problem," he said. "The land claim. I know that now." She turned the mug in her hands. "I'm saying I didn't know it then. And I should have asked instead of building the fear privately and letting it sit there." Martha had gone very still near the stove. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Fair enough. That was all. No speech about trust. No performance of being wounded by the suspicion. Just 2 words that meant, 'I understand.' And we're moving forward." Ellie found she could breathe easier after that. "The notebooks are still here?" she asked. "Under the floorboard in your room where you put them," he said. "I saw you do it about 3 weeks ago. I didn't touch them." She blinked. I figured they were yours to keep or share, as you decided, he said. Not my business. Martha refilled his coffee and went quietly out of the kitchen. They sat at the table for a while longer and let the silence do what silence sometimes needed to do, just hold things, without filling them in. The house made its sounds around them, wind in the eaves, the stove ticking as the metal expanded. Somewhere upstairs, a shutter loose in the frame. Ellie thought about the cabin, about waking up every hour or so through the night and seeing him by the fire, watching the door. She thought about the cut on his face that he hadn't mentioned, hadn't made anything of. She thought about the fact that he had ridden into a blizzard after her without stopping to decide whether she deserved it. People showed you who they were in the small moments, in what they did when there was nothing to gain from it. She had been watching Silas Boone for 2 months, and what she had seen was a man who acted on principle so consistently that he didn't seem to notice he was doing it anymore. It had become his default. That was rarer than almost anything else she'd encountered. We need to move on Harlan soon, she said. He's getting impatient. Last night proved that. He's not going to keep circling forever. Agreed. Silas set down his mug. Pratt needs everything you have. I'm ready to give it to him. She had made that decision somewhere in the small hours of the morning, watching the cabin fire burn down. Every name, every transaction, every clerk, all of it. Silas nodded. I'll send word to Pratt today. He can come to the ranch. And Lily, she said. She said it quietly, which was how she always said it. The name was precious, and it cost something every time. His eyes shifted. There was something there, not pity, which she couldn't have tolerated, but something more careful than that. One problem at a time, he said. We take down Harlan's legal cover, and finding Lily becomes possible. Right now, he controls enough of the law in this territory that any move toward her gets reported back to him. She knew that. She had known it for weeks. It didn't make it easier to hear. One problem at a time, she agreed. She went upstairs. She retrieved the notebooks from under the floorboard, 4 of them now, close written in her small, precise hand. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the first one and read through the first several pages. It was all there. She had been meticulous. Every transaction she'd seen in Harlan's shadow ledger, reconstructed from memory. The property descriptions, the false names, the dates, the dollar amounts, the names of the county clerks who'd accepted payments to look the other way. It was a complete picture of a fraud operation that spanned 4 counties and at least 6 years. She closed the notebook. She had spent months believing this information was a curse, that carrying it was what had gotten her onto that auction block, that knowing too much was the source of everything she'd lost. But knowledge wasn't the curse. Harlan's response to it was the curse, and she was going to use every word of it to dismantle him. She carried the notebooks downstairs and put them on the kitchen table. Tell Pratt to come as soon as he can, she said. Silas was already writing the letter. Pratt arrived on Thursday. He was a small man, as she'd known, with a precise way of moving that suggested. He thought about where he put things and why. He sat at the kitchen table with the notebook spread in front of him, and he read without speaking for an hour and a half, while Ellie and Silas sat at the other end of the table and left him to it. Martha brought lunch. Pratt ate without looking up. Finally, he closed the last notebook and looked at Ellie over the tops of his spectacles. This is sufficient, he said. Sufficient for what? Ellie asked. Federal charges. This crosses county lines, which takes it out of Harlan's influence over local courts. He straightened the notebooks into a neat stack. He's been controlling the territorial legal process for years, but he doesn't control the federal circuit. And if we bring this to Judge Aldrin in the Capitol, Harlan Croft won't be able to buy his way out. How long? Silas asked. Weeks, possibly. Aldrin is thorough. Pratt looked at Ellie. You'll need to be available to testify, as a verbal witness corroborating the written records. I'll testify, she said immediately. Pratt looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to. You understand that. Put you directly in Harlan's line of sight. If he knows you're preparing to testify, he already knows what I carry in my head, she said. That's why I'm here. Hiding hasn't made me safer. Moving forward is the only direction. Pratt folded his spectacles and put them in his breast pocket. He looked at Silas. You'd better be prepared for things to move quickly once I file. We'll be ready, Silas said. After Pratt left with the notebooks, copies. Ellie had made copies. The originals stayed in the floorboard. The house felt different, like a clock had started somewhere in the walls. Time was running now in a way it hadn't quite been before. That evening, Silas and Ellie sat on the porch. It was the first time they'd done that just sat, without a ledger or a notebook or a problem between them. The light was going gold in the west, turning the snow in the fields a pale orange color. Ida was visible at the fence line, moving slowly through the shallow drift near the water trough. Ellie said, "You told me the first night that you needed a wipe on paper, and I needed somewhere safe." "Yes," he said. "That was a business arrangement." It was. She looked at the light on the snow. "I don't think that's what this is anymore." He didn't answer immediately. She didn't rush him. That was something she'd learned, that Silas Boone's silences were not evasion. They were consideration. He was a man who thought before he spoke, and she had learned to respect that, rather than fill the space with noise. "No," he said finally. "It's not." She nodded once. She looked back at the field. "I'm not ready for more than that sentence right now," she said. "That sentence is enough," he said. They sat until the light was gone and the cold came back, and Martha called them in for supper. The shipping route came to her in the middle of the night. She'd been lying awake, turning over the logistics. The way she turned over problems when sleep wouldn't come methodically, starting from what she knew and moving outward in concentric circles. The current route cost too much, not because of the base rate, but because of the relay point. They were routing cattle through Heller Creek, which added 40 miles and required an overnight fee at the stockyards there. If they bypassed Heller Creek entirely and moved the herd directly to the junction at Caldwell Pass, they saved both the mileage cost and the stockyard fee. She got up and wrote it down. At breakfast, she put the numbers in front of Silas without preamble. He looked at the page. He looked at it for a while. He turned it sideways and then back. "The Caldwell Pass Road is rough," he said. "I know, but it's passable after the snow clears. And the fuel savings on cattle weight lost to the extra miles more than offsets the road maintenance cost." She had worked that out, too, on the second page. He read the second page. Martha poured coffee and managed to stay very busy with things near the stove. "All right," Silas said. "We'd need to renegotiate with Jensen's freighting. I drafted the letter." She put a third page on the table. He read it. He made one small change, a number in the penalty clause that she agreed was better, and signed it. She sent it that afternoon. Jensen's came back in 4 days with a counter. She countered their counter. They settled on terms that saved the ranch $230 per cattle run, which ran 4 times a year. Martha, when told the number, said, "Lord have mercy," and went back to her bread. The truth was that managing the ranch's books was not difficult work, not for Ellie. She had a mind built for numbers and for the particular geometry of contracts, the way a benefit to one party was always a cost to another, the way penalty clauses created hidden leverage that both parties could reach for. She'd had that mind her whole life and had never been given real room to use it until now. Silas noticed. He didn't make speeches about it. He just started bringing her every contract before he signed it. And when she made a change, he looked at her reasoning and learned from it. And after a while, he started drafting things differently on his own. That was the mark of a person who understood partnership. He didn't just accept help. He grew because of it. Pratt came back on a Tuesday morning with a look on his face that Ellie had not seen from him before. He sat down, declined coffee, and put his hands flat on the table. "I have intelligence," he said, "about the child." Ellie went very still. "Lily is in Harlan County," he said, "with a family named Mercer. Edgar and Catherine Mercer, wealthy landowners, established reputation in the county. They were told, through Harlan's network, that the child was an orphan abandoned during a difficult birth. The mother deceased." Ellie heard that. She processed it. "They don't know," she said, "by all appearances." "No," Pratt looked at her carefully. "They have had the child for 3 months. They appeared to have become attached. The kitchen was quiet. She thought about a woman named Catherine Mercer who had been told a child was an orphan, who had, presumably, opened her house and her life to that child in good faith. She thought about what it meant to have a baby placed in your arms with a story that was entirely a lie. Ellie didn't hate Catherine Mercer. She understood Catherine Mercer. That didn't make it simple. She's alive, Ellie said. Her voice was controlled. Lily is alive, and she's in a house with people who are caring for her. Yes, Pratt said. She breathed. She let that land all the way down to the floor of her. Lily was alive. Silas was watching her from across the table. She didn't look at him yet. She kept her eyes on Pratt. What's the legal position? She asked. Your marriage certificate establishes a legal household, Pratt said, and your freedom is established by the circumstances of your purchase and the document Mr. Boone signed. Harlan's authority over you has no legal basis. The child, however, he paused. Harlan used his connections to file documentation naming the child as an orphaned ward of the territory. Those papers have been accepted by the county court in Harlan. Which court? Silas said. Judge Perrin's court. Pratt said it with a particular flatness that meant something. Perrin is one of Harlan's men, Silas said. He is on the list in Miss Ellie's notebooks. Pratt confirmed. He accepted a payment of $300 approximately 18 months ago in connection with a property transaction in Harlan County. Ellie looked at the table. She thought about it clearly, without letting fear do the thinking. If Perrin is already compromised, she said, then going through his court does nothing. He'll rule against us and use the orphan documentation as cover. Correct, Pratt said. But if Harlan's operation comes down through the federal circuit before we move on Lily, then Perrin's authority becomes questionable at best. Pratt finished. And a federal ruling on your status would supersede the territorial orphan documentation entirely. She looked up. How close is Eldrin? Close, Pratt said. Weeks, perhaps 2. He is a thorough man, as I said, but he is thorough quickly. He allowed himself a small, precise smile. He was not pleased with what I brought him. Then we wait 2 weeks, Ellie said. Silas looked at her. 2 more weeks, she said. And then we go to Harlan County with federal backing, and we get my daughter back through a process that Harlan cannot touch. She kept her voice steady. If we go now, without that backing, we're walking into Perrin's court, and we'll lose her again. I'm not going through that. 2 weeks, Silas said. He wasn't agreeing or disagreeing. He was confirming he'd heard her. 2 weeks, she said again. She pushed back from the table and went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands. Not to cry, though there were tears, just to hold herself together in the concentrated dark behind her palms for a few minutes, with no one watching, in a space that was hers. Lily was alive. She was being cared for. She was alive. 2 weeks. She would get through 2 weeks. She came back downstairs an hour later. Silas and Pratt had gone out to the porch. She went to the kitchen, and Martha was at the stove, and Ellie stood beside her, and they were quiet together for a while. She's alive, Ellie said. I heard, Martha said, in a good house. Good, Martha said, means she's healthy when you get her back. Ellie looked at her. Martha turned and looked back, direct and even. And you will get her back, she said. That is not in question. It was the most Martha had ever said in one go about anything that wasn't practical. Ellie nodded once. Martha turned back to the stove. The 2 weeks were not quiet. Harlan's pressure continued small aggressions, the kind designed to wear you down rather than confront you directly. A section of fence cut, cattle let through, a delivery of supplies that went missing between town and the ranch. A rumor circulated in Heller Creek that the Boone operation was failing financially, bad enough that 2 of their regular hands came in asking whether they'd still be paid. Silas handled each thing, calmly, practically, without escalating. He fixed the fence. He found a different supplier. He paid his men in front of witnesses and told them to pass it along. Ellie watched how he absorbed pressure without letting it bend him, and she thought about what it took to be that steady. not the absence of fear or frustration. She could see both in him sometimes, in the tight line of his jaw or the particular silence that came before a hard decision. But he had built the habit of choosing his response rather than just having one. That habit was a form of discipline she recognized and respected. She was building the same habit. It was hard work. Some days it went better than others. In the evenings, they went over the books together. And when the business of the ranch was settled, they talked about other things. She told him about her grandmother, the woman she'd named Ida, after a woman who had survived things. Ellie was still trying to understand, and had come out the other side with her humor intact. He told her about the first winter he'd spent alone in this territory, 19 years old, running traps and learning the land the hard way. They talked like people who were beginning to know each other. One evening, he said, without looking up from the ledger, "You're going to be all right. You know." She looked at him. "When this is over," he said, "when Harlan's done and Lily's home, you're going to know what to do with yourself." "You sound certain," she said. "I've watched you for 3 months." He said, "Yes, I'm certain." She looked back at her own page. She thought about certainty, and where it lived, whether it was something given to you from the outside or something you built inside yourself from small daily acts of staying present and keeping going. She had been certain of very little in the past year. The ground had kept moving under her. But here, in this kitchen, with the books spread on the table and the fire going, and Silas across from her, saying things he meant, she found a version of it, small and solid. Nothing like certainty had felt before, which had always been a thin and brittle thing. This was more like the fencing around the South Paddock. Practical, built to hold. 10 days after Pratt's visit, the letter from Judge Aldrin arrived. Silas brought it in from the post and set it on the table without opening it. He looked at her. She opened it. She read it. She set it back down. "He's ruled," she said. "Federal charges filed against Harlan Croft for land fraud across 4 counties. Warrants issued for 6 associates named in the notebooks. Perrin is suspended pending investigation." Silas let out a long, slow breath. "And my status," she said. She had to keep her voice steady. "He's declared me a free woman under federal jurisdiction. Full legal standing. The territorial orphan papers on Lily are invalidated as having been filed through a corrupt court." The kitchen was silent. Martha sat down in her chair at the head of the table, which Martha never did in the middle of the day. "Then we ride for Harlan County," Silas said. "Tomorrow," Ellie said. She needed one night to be ready, one night to sleep and breathe and hold herself together so she could walk into that county as a free woman and a mother, and not come apart at the threshold. "Tomorrow," he agreed. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her pocket, close to her chest, the same place she'd kept the notebook page he'd written on the first night. She went to the window and looked out at the ranch. The snow was mostly gone now. The garden stakes along the south wall were visible again, dark lines against the pale ground. New growth was coming up around them, the first green of the season. She watched the field for a long time. Behind her, she heard Silas get up and go to the stove, heard the familiar sounds of the kitchen moving around her, solid and ordinary and real. She had a daughter to bring home. She had work to do. She turned away from the window. They rode for Harlan County at first light. 3 of them, Ellie, Silas, and a man named Cole, who worked the ranch and had the kind of quiet steadiness that Silas trusted on the road. The morning was cold and clear, the sky a flat pale blue that stretched from one edge of the territory to the other without a single cloud. Ellie rode Ida. She had slept the night before, actually slept, which surprised her. She had expected to lie awake with her mind running at full speed, but instead she had gone down fast and deep and woken up before dawn, already alert, already ready. Her body knew they were moving toward Lily. That was enough. She carried the letter from Judge Aldrin in her breast pocket. She carried her revolver at her hip. She carried 4 months of grief and fury and carefully maintained hope. And she kept all of it in check by focusing on the road. Silas rode slightly ahead on the narrow stretches and beside her on the wider ones. He didn't talk much, but she was used to that. His presence was its own kind of steadiness. She had come to rely on it, the way you relied on a well-built fence line, not thinking about it constantly, just knowing it was there. Harlan County was 6 hours of hard riding. They arrived in the early afternoon. The Mercer property was not difficult to find. It was the kind of place that announced itself a long drive lined with cottonwood trees. A substantial house set back from the road, white painted with a wide porch and glass windows that caught the light. Working land behind it, well kept. A family with money and roots in this county. Ellie looked at the house from the end of the drive. She thought about Catherine Mercer inside that house with her daughter. She had spent weeks thinking about this woman as an obstacle, as someone standing between her and Lily, even unknowingly, but riding up that long drive, looking at the carefully tended yard and the wreath still on the door from winter. She understood that what she was riding toward was not a fight. It was a conversation between two people who had both been used by Harlan Croft, just in entirely different ways. She stopped Ida at the porch steps and dismounted. She didn't wait for Silas to help. She didn't need it. She knocked. The woman who came to the door was perhaps 40, with light brown hair pinned back and a dress that was practical rather than decorative. She had an intelligent face and careful eyes, and she looked at Ellie, then at Silas and Cole behind her, and then back at Ellie. "Mrs. Mercer," Ellie said, "my name is Eleanor Vance Boone. I believe you have my daughter." The woman's face did something complicated, a sequence of things: recognition, resistance, then something that looked almost like grief. "You'd better come in," she said. The parlor was warm and nicely furnished, and on the floor in the corner there was a basket with a quilt in it, and beside the basket, propped against the settle, was a cloth doll with button eyes. Ellie saw those things and kept her breathing even. Catherine Mercer sat across from her. Edgar Mercer, her husband, had been sent for and arrived from the back of the house looking wary and red-faced. Silas stood near the door. Cole waited outside. "We were told she was abandoned," Edgar Mercer said. His voice was defensive from the first word. "I know what you were told," Ellie said. She kept her tone level. "And I believe you believed it. The man who told you is named Harlan Croft. He is currently facing federal charges for fraud across 4 counties, which includes the false documentation he used to place my daughter in your care." She took the letter from Aldrin out of her pocket and set it on the table. Edgar Mercer picked it up. He read it. His color changed slowly. "Federal Circuit," he said. "Yes," Ellie said. He looked at Silas, then back at the letter, then at his wife. Catherine Mercer was not looking at the letter. She was looking at Ellie. Her hands were folded in her lap and her knuckles were white. And she was doing the same thing Ellie was doing, keeping herself together through will. "Alone. She's been here 4 months," Catherine said. "I know," Ellie said. "She was very small when she came to us. She'd lost weight. She was cold." Her voice broke slightly on that. "She recovered it. We've cared for her every day. My husband and I, we—" She stopped. Ellie leaned forward. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, "I believe you. I believe every word of what you just said. You opened your home to a child you were told had no one. You gave her warmth and food and care. That is not a small thing." She paused. "But she has someone. She has always had someone. She has me." The room was very quiet. "I gave birth to her in a house where I had no rights," Ellie continued. "I held her for 3 hours before she was taken. 3 hours. And then I was sold at auction in the rain. Everything that came after. That everything I have done for the past 4 months has been to get back to her." Catherine Mercer looked at her hands. "Harlan Croft used your goodness against you," Ellie said. "He found a woman who would love a child and care for her well. And he put my daughter in your arms with a lie. He didn't do that for Lily's sake. He did it to create a complication, to give himself leverage and create a legal knot he could pull later. He used your love for my child as a weapon against me." Edgar Mercer set the letter down. He looked at his wife. "Catherine," he said quietly. Catherine Mercer lifted her eyes to Ellie. They were full. She didn't blink the tears back, which Ellie respected. She started smiling. Catherine said, real smiling. "The past few weeks. She knows my voice." "I know." Ellie's own voice was barely above a whisper now. That's because of you. You gave her that. Where will you take her? Home, Ellie said. To a ranch with a good house and a kitchen garden and a housekeeper who makes the best bread I've ever eaten. She'll be loved there. She'll be safe there. Harlan Croft will not be able to reach her. Catherine Mercer sat for a long moment. The clock on the mantel ticked through the silence. Edgar put his hand over his wife's. Then Catherine stood. She went out of the room and down the hall, and they heard her footsteps on the stairs. The house was quiet. The cloth doll sat against the settle with its button eyes. Ellie looked at her own hands on her knees. She pressed them flat. Silas had not moved from the doorway. He was watching her, and whatever he saw in her face, he kept to himself. Catherine Mercer came back down the stairs. She was carrying a baby. Ellie stood up. Lily was larger than she had been. 4 months larger. She had a round face and dark eyes, and a white knitted cap pushed slightly sideways on her head. She was awake and alert, looking at the room with the focused concentration of a baby, discovering that the world is large and full of things. Her eyes found Ellie's face. Ellie crossed the room. She took Lily from Catherine Mercer's arms, and she held her daughter against her chest, and she pressed her face into that small, warm neck, and she breathed. She did not fall apart. She had promised herself she would not, and she did not. She stood there with her daughter in her arms and breathed and let the reality of it land. Lily was here. Lily was real and warm and present. Lily was alive. After a moment, Lily made a sound, small and experimental. She grabbed a fistful of Ellie's coat collar and held on. Ellie straightened up. Catherine Mercer was watching them with her arms folded across her chest, holding herself. There were tears on her face. She didn't wipe them. I'd like to send a few things with her, Catherine said. The quilt, some clothes she's used to. Yes, Ellie said. Of course. And Catherine paused. She swallowed. If there is ever any question about her care or her health, anything you need, you can write to us. Ellie looked at her for a moment. I will write to you, she said, not because I need to, but because you loved her when I couldn't. She should know that someday. The two women looked at each other across that room, across the loss and the love and the damage that Harlan Croft had put between them without either of their consents. The door flew open. The sheriff came in without knocking. He was a broad man with a tin star and the look of someone who knew he was about to do something uncomfortable, but had been paid enough not to care. 2 deputies stood behind him. Eleanor Vance, he said. I have a warrant for your arrest. Charge of kidnapping a minor ward of the territory. The parlor went ice still. Edgar Mercer stood up. Now, see here, sir, I'd advise you to step back. Ellie did not move. She held Lily against her chest. She looked at the sheriff, and she looked at the warrant in his hand, and she thought, Perrin is suspended. He filed this before Aldrin's ruling, or someone in Harlan's network saw us ride in. That warrant, she said calmly, was issued by Judge Perrin, who is currently suspended by federal order pending investigation for corruption. The sheriff hesitated. I have the federal ruling in my pocket, she said. The child is not a ward of the territory. That documentation has been invalidated. You are attempting to execute a warrant issued by a suspended judge in a case that has been superseded by federal jurisdiction. She looked at him steadily. You can try to take me, she said, but I suggest you speak to your county attorney before you do, because the next person you'll be answering to is Judge Aldrin, and he is not a patient man. The sheriff looked at his deputies. He looked at Silas, who hadn't moved from the doorway, but whose hand was resting on his rifle in a way that was not quite a threat, but was absolutely a statement. He looked at the baby in Ellie's arms. I'm going to need to verify this, he said. Verify it, Ellie said. We'll wait. He backed up. He sent one deputy out. He stood in the doorway, looking deeply unhappy about his afternoon. Silas crossed the room and stood beside Ellie. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, and his presence was a kind of wall. Ellie held her daughter and waited. They rode back through the night. Silas had made the decision after the sheriff left, after the deputy had come back, red-faced, and confirmed that yes, Perrin was suspended. Yes, the federal ruling was valid. Yes, the warrant was unenforceable. Silas had made the decision the moment they walked out of the Mercer house. And he looked at the sky and then at the surrounding land. "We ride now," he said. "We don't stay in this county." Ellie had already been thinking the same thing. Cole took the lead, knowing the roads. Silas rode rear. Ellie carried Lily, wrapped against her chest in the way Catherine Mercer had shown her, a long piece of flannel, wrapped and tied, leaving both hands free for the reins. Lily slept through most of it, which was something close to miraculous. They made good time. They were back at the ranch before dawn. Martha had stayed up. The lights were on. When Ellie came through the door with Lily against her chest, Martha stood in the kitchen doorway and put one hand over her mouth and then took it away and turned back to the stove. And the set of her shoulders said everything she wasn't going to put into words. Ellie sat down at the kitchen table and unwound the flannel and looked at her daughter in the full light for the first time. Lily was perfect. She was healthy and round-cheeked, and she smelled like soap and milk and the particular warmth of a sleeping baby. She had dark hair coming in fine and soft. She had Ellie's hands, Ellie could see that already small and precise, curled against her chest. She sat there for a long time. Silas made coffee and put a cup beside her and went back to the counter. Martha put bread and cold meat on the table without a word. Nobody told Ellie what she was feeling or what to do with it. They just moved around her and let her have the moment, which was exactly right. 3 days passed quietly. Then Harlan Croft's patience ran out. Ellie had been expecting it. She'd told Silas so the morning after they came back. Harlan was losing. The federal charges were filed. Perrin was suspended. His network was starting to come apart at the seams. As the men named in her notebooks began making decisions about their own survival. He had one move left, and they both knew what it was. He would come for the ranch directly. "He'll come at night," Silas said. "Yes," she agreed. "He can't afford subtlety anymore. He needs to silence me before I testify." They prepared. Silas reinforced the shutters on the ground floor windows. He moved the cattle to the far pasture, out of range of any fire. He posted Cole on the north fence line and brought in 2 more hands, reliable men he'd known for years, to cover the east approach. Ellie prepared the cellar. It was a good cellar, dry, deep, with stone walls and a heavy wooden door set into the kitchen floor. She put blankets down there and a lamp and enough supplies for several days. She put Lily's quilt from the Mercers down there too, and the cloth doll with the button eyes. She hoped she wouldn't need any of it. Martha came into the cellar while she was arranging things and looked at the setup and nodded. "I'm staying up here," Martha said. "I can shoot. I've been shooting since I was 9 years old, and I intend to do it until I can't." "I know," Ellie said. I wasn't going to argue. Martha looked at her. Good. They ate supper early and didn't talk much after Lily was down. Ellie took the Winchester from the rack in the hallway. She loaded it in the kitchen, working methodically, the way Silas had shown her 2 weeks earlier, when they'd both understood this was coming. She had practiced every day since. She was not an expert. She was accurate enough. Silas came in from checking the perimeter. He looked at her with the Winchester and said nothing except, "Rounds are on the shelf." "I know," she said. "I put them there." The attack came at midnight. She heard it before she saw it, the dogs. Then hooves. Many hooves. Then a sound she hadn't heard before and hoped never to hear again. The particular rushing crackle of fire catching on dry wood. They'd lit something at the east corner of the barn. Silas was out the door before she'd finished processing what she'd heard. "Martha," Ellie said. "Go," Martha said. She already had her own rifle from somewhere Ellie hadn't known about. Ellie put Lily in the cellar first. She went down the steps with her daughter, wrapped and sleeping, and she laid her in the nest of blankets in the corner. And she lit the small lamp, and she looked at Lily's face for 3 seconds. 3 seconds. And then she came back up and closed the cellar door. She went to the window. Outside was chaos. Lantern light and firelight mixed together in the dark, throwing everything into violent orange and black. She could see men moving at the fence line, at least 8, maybe more. Silas was at the corner of the barn with Cole, returning fire, his silhouette moving and controlled in the noise and the light. Two of Harlan's men tried the front porch. Ellie shot through the shutter. She didn't hit either of them. They flung themselves sideways and scrambled back, but they went back, which was the point. She reloaded fast. Her hands were steady. She noticed that as if from a distance. Her hands were completely steady. She crossed to the other window. Another man had gotten to the side of the house and was working at the shutters with something. She leveled the rifle and said through the wood, "I will shoot through this wall if you don't move." And the sound of scraping stopped, and she heard boots on gravel moving away fast. The fire on the barn was bad. She could hear it now, properly loud, and the light through the windows on the east side of the house was too bright and too orange for midnight. But Silas had the well positioned between the house and the barn. She had noticed that when she first arrived how the well stood exactly where you'd want it in an emergency. Cole was working the bucket line with one of the other hands, while the second hand kept the attackers from advancing. Glass shattered, somewhere on the ground floor. Martha's rifle went off once from the hall. Then silence from that direction. "Martha," Ellie called. "Still here." Martha called back. Her voice was completely level. Ellie moved through the house. She stayed low at windows, checked each room, kept moving. She had done this in her head a dozen times over the past 3 days, walking the floor plan, thinking about angles and sight lines. It was paying off now. She knew where she was and what she could see from each position. The attack was not going well for Harlan's men. They'd expected a house to overwhelm. They'd found a defended position with people who had been ready for them. And the 3 days of preparation were showing in every choice. Silas had made the reinforced shutters, the perimeter coverage, the cellar for Lily, the ammunition on every shelf. Preparing for what is coming is not pessimism. It is the most fundamental form of caring for the people who depend on you. The firing from the east fence line thinned. 2 men down, she thought, not dead, but out of the fight. Cole had pushed the others back past the tree line. The barn fire was still burning, but it wasn't spreading. The stone foundation was holding, and the wood Silas had wet down 2 days ago was resisting. Ellie moved back to the kitchen. She stood at the window and looked at the yard. The main thrust was breaking up. She could see Harlan's men reassessing, pulling back, the coordination coming apart. That was the thing about violence used as a tool of control. It worked when the target was isolated and afraid. It fell apart when the target was prepared and had people standing beside them. She scanned the yard, Cole at the fence. The 2 hands, one crouched at the barn corner, one at the water trough. She couldn't see Silas. She moved to the back window. There. He was at the corner of the house on the blind side, moving along the wall, tracking something in the shadows. She couldn't see what he was tracking. She pressed her face to the glass and tried to widen her angle. A figure came out of the dark from the south, moving fast and low, using the smoke from the barn as cover, angling directly for Silas's back. The smoke was thick enough that neither of the other hands could see this angle. Cole was still managing the fence line. Nobody was watching the south approach. Nobody except Ellie. She had 3 seconds, maybe less. She did not think about it. Thinking in 3 seconds was a luxury she did not have. She moved to the back door, opened it 6 inches, found the angle, braced the rifle against the doorframe. She could see the shape of the man. Dark coat, arm coming up. The particular way a person moves when they are about to do something they cannot take back. She pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the night air. The figure dropped. Silas spun around. He looked at the figure on the ground. He looked at the back door where Ellie stood with the rifle. He looked back at the ground. Harlan Croft lay in the dirt of the yard, 5 feet behind where Silas had been standing. The revolver was still in his hand. The night went very quiet. Ellie stood in the doorway with the rifle and she breathed. She was breathing hard, she realized, though she hadn't noticed it until now. She looked at the shape on the ground and she did not look away, because she had done what she'd done and she would not pretend otherwise or flinch from it. Harlan Croft had aimed at Silas's back. He was going to pull the trigger. She had pulled hers first. That was the whole of it. Silas walked back to the house. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face carefully. "I'm all right," she said. I know, he said. She lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking now. Finally, the steadiness breaking apart in the aftermath. He put his hand over hers on the rifle, not to take it, just to be there while the shaking ran through her. She let it, and then she stopped. Cole's voice came from the fence line. The last of Harlan's men were gone, running, surrendering, or down but gone. The barn fire burned on in the dark, but it was controllable now. The house stood. The yard was still. Ellie handed Silas the rifle and went back inside. She went to the kitchen floor and lifted the cellar door and went down the steps and picked up her daughter. Lily was awake. She looked up at Ellie with those dark-focused eyes, perfectly calm, as if she had simply been waiting for someone to come back. I'm here, Ellie said. I'm here. We're all right. She carried Lily back up into the kitchen. Martha was at the stove already, because Martha dealt with crisis by making sure people ate. The lamp was on. The room smelled like smoke and wood smoke and coffee. Silas came in through the back door and looked at Ellie with Lily in her arms. And the expression on his face was one she had never seen from him before. He looked at the two of them, and something shifted in him that he didn't bother to hide. He sat down at the table. Martha put coffee in front of him. Outside, the night was finally beginning to quiet. The trial took 3 weeks, not a territorial trial, which Harlan's remaining allies would have done everything to slow or obstruct. A federal trial in the capital, before Judge Aldrin. The courtroom was plain and practical, and Aldrin ran it the same way, no tolerance for delay or theater. Just a steady march through evidence and testimony. Ellie testified for 2 days. She had prepared for it the way she prepared, for everything, methodically, starting with what she knew and building outward. She sat in the witness chair, and she spoke clearly, and she did not look away from the defense. She answered every question put to her, and she did not embellish or deflect or soften what she had seen and heard. In Harlan Croft's household, she told the truth, which was enough, more than enough. The notebooks were entered into evidence. Every name, every transaction, every county clerk who'd accepted a bribe. The shadow ledger she had reconstructed from memory verified against the real records that federal investigators had seized from Harlan's offices after his death was accurate to within rounding errors. Pratt made the closing argument. He was precise and unhurried and devastating. 6 of Harlan's associates took plea arrangements in exchange for cooperation. 2 others were convicted on separate counts. Judge Aldrin's rulings came down over 2 days, and when they were all delivered, Harlan Croft's fraud network was legally and completely dismantled. Property was returned to homesteaders who had been defrauded. Clerks were removed from office. A land management reform was attached to the rulings that Pratt said would matter for decades. On the last day of proceedings, Judge Aldrin called Ellie's case specifically. He read from his ruling in the flat, measured voice of a man who had long ago understood that the most important things did not need to be performed. Eleanor Vance Boone was declared a free woman under federal law with full legal standing. Her marriage to Silas Boone was recognized as valid and entered into voluntarily. All prior documentation that had constrained her freedom or status was invalidated. Her daughter, Lily, was formally recognized as her legal child with no competing claims. The courtroom was quiet when he finished. Ellie sat very still. Pratt leaned over and said, in his precise, careful way, "That is everything." She nodded. She couldn't speak yet, so she didn't try. Silas, beside her, said nothing either. He put his hand on the table next to hers, not quite touching, just close. She turned her hand over, and he held it, and they sat like that in the quiet courtroom while Aldrin moved on to the next matter on his docket. She was free, completely, legally, in every document and in every court. She was free. She had been free since the first night, in the ways that mattered most. But there was something about having it declared, having it put on paper by a court that could not be bought or influenced or made, to look the other way, that completed something she hadn't known was still incomplete. They rode home 2 days later. The territory was coming fully into spring now. The cottonwoods along the creek had leafed out in that pale, almost translucent green they got in early May. The grass was coming up thick. The sky was the specific deep blue that only existed for about 3 weeks in the spring. Before the summer heat changed everything, Lily rode with Ellie, wrapped against her the way she'd traveled from Harlan County that night. She was awake and interested in the road, turning her head to look at trees and sky and birds. Martha had the house open when they arrived, windows and doors, airing everything out after the long winter. The kitchen smelled like bread, and she had coffee ready before they'd finished putting the horses up, because that was Martha, and it always would be. The barn had been repaired. 2 of the hands had worked on it while Ellie and Silas were in the capital. The new wood was pale against the old, but it was solid. It would weather in. The garden along the south wall was coming in. Ellie stood on the porch and looked at it. The rows she and Martha had planted in early spring were showing now small green threads of life, pushing up through the dark soil. Everything exactly where they'd put it. The staking she'd done in the cold had held. It was going to be a good garden. Silas came to stand beside her. He had the marriage certificate in his hand. She looked at it. He held it out flat between them, and she could see him preparing to do what he'd clearly been thinking about for a while. Tear it in half. Give her the halves. Make visible and concrete the thing he'd been saying since the first night. That she was free. That none of this was ever a claim on her. She put her hand over his. He stopped. She took the certificate from him and looked at it. The simple language. The 2 signatures. The date. The piece of paper that had started as a legal shield and had become something else entirely over the months between then and now. She folded it once and held it. You said the first night that you needed a wife, she said, and I needed a home. He was watching her face. She looked at the garden. She looked at the repaired barn, pale new wood against old. She looked at Ida moving peacefully along the fence line in the late afternoon sun. She looked at the house behind them, where Martha was moving in the kitchen, and the smell of bread was coming through the open window. She looked at her daughter, asleep now against her chest, one small fist curled against Ellie's collarbone. She rested her head against Silas's shoulder. I choose this home, she said. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual. You're sure? I've been sure for a while, she said. I just needed everything else to be settled first. He put his arm around her, slow and careful, and she let him. She stayed where she was, her head on his shoulder, her daughter between them, looking out at the land that was green and coming alive after a long, cold season. In the kitchen, Martha dropped something and said a word she would never admit to saying, and then started humming to cover it, and the sound floated out through the open window and mixed with the birdsong and the distant sound of the creek, running fast with snowmelt. Lily stirred, made a small sound, settled back. The light went golden across the field, the particular gold of late afternoon in spring, when everything the cold had buried was finally and undeniably present. The fencing cast long shadows across the new grass. The cottonwoods along the creek moved in the light wind. Ellie had not planned any of this. She had not planned surviving the auction block, or the blizzard, or the raid, or the long, slow weeks of learning to breathe in a house that turned out to be safe. She had not planned falling into something with a man who knocked on doors and left revolvers on tables and rode into blizzards without being asked. She had planned only one thing, to find her daughter and keep her. She had done that. Everything else, the ranch, the garden, the work that had turned out to be hers to do, the man standing beside her with his arm around her shoulders. Everything else had grown out of the decision to survive and to remain herself while surviving. It had grown out of refusing to let what had been done to her define what she became. That was the truth she carried now, and it was not a burden. It was a foundation. She unfolded the marriage certificate and looked at it again. Then she folded it back up and tucked it into her pocket. She would keep it, not because she needed it, not because it held her here or required anything of her, but because it was the document that had started the path, and the path had led her here, and here was worth remembering how you found it. Silas said nothing. He understood, the way he understood most things by watching and by waiting, and by trusting that what people showed you with their actions was the truth of them. They stood on the porch together until the sun was down and the first stars were out, and Martha called them in for supper. Ellie carried Lily inside. The door closed behind them. In the garden along the south wall, the green rose kept growing in the dark, steady and quiet, the way everything real grows. Not all at once, not with any announcement, just forward, just alive, just that. There's a moment near the end that I keep coming back to. Silas pulls out the marriage certificate, ready to tear it in half. He's standing on that porch, fully prepared to let her go, not because he wants her to leave, but because he never believed he had the right to make her stay. And Ellie stops his hand. She takes the paper, folds it, and puts it in her own pocket. She keeps it, not because she has to, because she chooses to. And that's single, quiet. Completely free choice is what the whole story has been building toward from the very first night. When we meet Ellie, every choice has been taken from her. Her body, her labor, her child, her freedom, all of it decided by other people. She has nothing left but her mind and her spine, and she holds on to both so hard it almost breaks her. Then Silas does something so simple, it shouldn't be remarkable. He knocks before entering a room. He lets her pick her own horse. He leaves a revolver on the kitchen table with a note. Use it if you need to, even on me. He doesn't rescue her. He creates the conditions in which she can rescue herself. There is a profound difference between those two things. Because Ellie doesn't heal because Silas is good to her. She heals because his goodness gives her room to do the work herself. She saves the ranch's finances. She rebuilds Harlan's entire fraud network from memory. She loads the Winchester. She pulls the trigger when it counts. Every single one of those things is her. A person's worth is not determined by who stands beside them. It is built from what they do with the ground they are standing on. And Harlan, he represents something we recognize far beyond 1,873. He never attacks directly. He poisons the creek. He forges documents designed to make Ellie doubt Silas, rather than confronting either of them openly. He understands that the most effective way to destroy a person is to make them break themselves through fear, through isolation, through manufactured distrust. Manipulation targets what already hurts. It finds the crack in your certainty and pours itself in. The antidote is not to have no cracks. It is to have people around you who earn trust slowly through consistent action, so that when the doubt arrives, you have something real to hold on to. Ellie doesn't make peace with what was done to her. What she does is refuse to let it be the final word on who she is. She takes everything she suffered, everything she memorized, every sharp edge that survival gave her, and she turns it into the instrument of Harlan's destruction. That is not moving on. That is transforming damage into purpose. So what do you take from a story like this? You take the reminder that healing happens in the accumulation of small, kept promises, that your memory, your mind, your knowledge, the things that cannot be auctioned or stolen, are your most durable possessions. That real partnership is not about one person protecting another. It is about two people who make each other more capable than they would be alone. And you take this. A free choice only means something when you could have chosen otherwise. Ellie could have walked away. Silas would have let her. But she chose to stay as a woman who belonged completely to herself, who had passed through the worst, and come out knowing exactly who she was. She rested her head on his shoulder and said, "I choose this home." And that was everything. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And stay with us, because there is always another woman standing at the edge of the dark, deciding whether to trust the fire. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.